Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was born in 1712 in Geneva, Switzerland, to Suzanne Bernard and Isaac Rousseau. About 9 days after childbirth, his mother died, and he was raised by his father till about the age of 10, when he fled France to avoid imprisonment. From that time forward, he was raised by some family members till about age 16, and in that time he was an apprentice to an engraver until he, too, fled to France. Not to avoid imprisonment, just simply because he wanted to leave Geneva. When he got to France, he met Baroness de Warens, who named him her steward, and she paid for his education, and eventually he became her lover, only for a short period of time, but still. And at about age 30, so this was some years later, he finally made it to Paris, and there he met Denis Diderot, and they both were philosophers and writers for the French Encyclopedia, which is a type of newspaper pamphlet organization where they print the words of people with different thoughts, because this was the Enlightenment period, and so there was all kinds of new ideas that were always coming out. And from his education, Rousseau was also a musician. He ended up writing a very successful opera in English called The Village Soothsayer. Even the king of France at the time loved it, and he was good enough that if he would have chosen, he could have had a comfortable life and a successful life as a composer. But that's not what he chose to do. In 1768, he married Therese Levasseur. He had known her since 1745, and he'd kept her as a mistress. They didn't get married until this point. He died 10 years later in 1778 in Armenonville, France. So at age 37 is when Rousseau had his epiphany. This epiphany is what brought him to his own personal philosophy and what he shared through all of his writings, and why he's one of these educational giants. His idea, basically, is that modern progress corrupts rather than improves people, and he believes in human goodness. So essentially, people are good by nature, but through society and progress, they become corrupted. With this thought, he goes through two different types of love. Amour de soi, which is a self-love, and amour propre, which is a self-love based on the relationship with others in society. So basically, our personal self-worth, how we view ourselves, how worthy we think we are, based on what we think and how much we take into account what others think about us. Now, before this was a thing, there is what Rousseau want to call the golden age of society. And this is something he brings up in one of his writings, the discourse on the origin of inequality. Essentially what he says is that there was a time when no one had this amour propre, where their love for themselves was based on what others thought of them. And all they had was this amour de soi, the self-love, the self-preservation, trying to survive, because that was what was essential. This is, going back to this is his idea on like the psychological and philosophical idea of how the human evolution and how society corrupted people. So he believes that people were good, and people are good, but progress is what corrupts them. So at this time, there was no progress, and there was no societies. It was just people trying to survive and concerned with their own self-preservation. And like with all progress, societies began to form because the population was growing. So people began to cohabitate shelters, and these shelters began to cohabitate the same space, and different responsibilities were given, and what you might even begin to call villages. So these people went and hunted, these people went and cooked, and these people, all of these things that we give to different people that take on these roles. And at this time, people began to take on these roles, and there's other people doing some parts of things for them, and they don't have to rely solely on themselves, is when they began to form this unhealthy amour propre, where they began to compare themselves and compare what they had to what others had. And this is when they began to find fault within others and within themselves, and this is when the evil and the downfall begins, according to Rousseau. But how his philosophy pertains to education can be found in his book Emile. And he gives these ideas. He says pretty much that a child has a tutor, and the child is kept from society until they reach adolescence. And then there are 4 stages he gives. The first stage is essentially freedom for the child. This is when the child is young. So it's time for them not to be dominated, or for the tutor to exercise their power of authority over the student. This is a chance for the child to be free within reason. The second stage is when the tutor begins to teach the student abstract thoughts and concepts, and they learn these things through hands-on experiments. And so by the time they reach the third stage, which is adolescence, they are entering society with some kind of education and some kind of knowledge. This is where the tutor is very, very present. They're present all the time, but they need to be very present here in order to make sure that this amour self-propre comes out healthily, that their own self-love is so definite and ingrained in them that these opinions that they're just now learning that other people have of them personally will not have such a traumatic effect on them the way that maybe it happens with teenagers today. And so they're there, but they're trying to let them grow. And the final stage is when the child is all grown up now, and the tutor becomes a type of confidant or advisor for their old pupil. And the child goes out into society and they get married, and they are introduced to different works of worldly philosophies. Of course, Rousseau recommends that they read his because this is his teaching style. So, but it's where they begin to actually learn and read about things that are actually in the world. Because before, everything was pretty much screened through the tutor, what they allowed this person to learn, this child to learn, so that they would grow up healthily with the self-worth of themselves. So this type of teaching is his contribution, is essentially what we can call negative education. And what negative education does is it focuses on the individual. And this individual learns at their own pace. And when they learn at their own pace, it's supposed to follow the natural course of learning. So they're not being forced to learn more quickly. There's not these timed tests. There's not these other students to compare how dumb or how smart you are because how fast you get done or how many good grades you get. They don't know anything, so it's just natural course, and they're learning simply for the love of learning and to become smarter. And there is no predetermined curriculum in this, which is quite different than how most schools are actually run. But how we might compare that to teaching today is this student-to-teacher ratio. We see in a lot of pamphlets for colleges that when they have a low student-to-teacher ratio, there's more time for one-on-one, which has come to be very important in order for the success of a student, is the teacher needs to be teaching an individual rather than a crowd. And I personally was thinking about how this might relate to some of the teaching styles that we've learned so far this semester. And the first one I first thought of was the progressivism, because progressivism believes in learning through hands-on experiments, which is literally the second stage of Rousseau's teaching. And then there was also existentialism, which believes in the responsibility and the choices and the responsibility for those choices. And I thought this related because the tutor's not there to force the child to learn. They're there to encourage them and to be next to them rather in front or behind them. And the student is essentially the one that chooses what they learn and how they learn it. So they have to take responsibility for who they're going to be someday when they enter society. They have to take that responsibility based on what they learn and how they learn it now. And then also I was thinking behaviorism, and there was a quote from the Creating Mighty Oaks that we read from, and it says, "Behaviorism is derived from the belief that free will is an illusion. According to a pure behaviorist, human beings are shaped entirely by their external environment." And I think that Rousseau, he believes in this a lot, because this is why he wants to keep them from society, is because he does believe that people are shaped by their environment. And so he wants to keep them out of society until they're already grown and they're already molded, so that the society can't mold them into something else, something what he believes is evil. And so I think it also relates to behaviorism entirely. And here's a couple of his most popular writings. Like I brought up before, Discourse on the Origin of Inequalities, where we learn about this golden age of society that he calls it. We also have Emile, which is also known as On the Education of Emile, which is where he shares his own personal beliefs from his philosophy on how education should be handled. We also have The Social Contract and Julie actually is no discourse, and it's no philosophical writing. It's just a nonfiction story that he wrote, and it happens to be one of his most popular. My own personal application to this is I've actually seen this teaching style, his philosophy, in action. My mom homeschools my 6 of my younger siblings, and this is essentially how she teaches. She asks them what they want to learn, and that's kind of what they focus on. And instead of having like lots of worksheets or tests or anything, they do experiments, and they go to museums, and they watch videos, and they do projects, essentially. And I mean, I guess it's a good way. It's a way to really get your students involved. But to me, I guess just the way I see it at home, maybe, sometimes it seems too unstructured. And this idea of not having a curriculum is very frustrating to me, because you can't go in blind. I mean, you have to be able to change what you're gonna have your every day on. You know, you have to have that ability, but you need to have a curriculum, in my opinion. And so I think there's positives and there's negatives to his philosophy and how it applies to education, because it's a good idea to be involved in the individual, and I think it's very important to be involved in the individual, but I think the idea of having no curriculum is it's too random and too unstructured. And so this is what I think about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Here's some information about him and what I believe about his philosophy. Thanks for watching.